Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, the show that remembers the good and sometimes the not so good old days of parenting past. I'm your host, Samantha Kemp-Jackson from the Multiple Mayhem Mama blog, and every week we'll be talking about how things were then and how they are now, parenting through the lens of the ages, if you will. Now, whether you're a parent, a kid, or someone who used to be a kid, you'll want to stay tuned as we reminisce about the past, embrace the future, and marvel in the present how things have changed. If you're ready to glance back in time at kids, parenting, and the good old days, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's take a trip down parenting's memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Life is all about making lemonade out of lemons, isn't it? Sometimes when things don't go the way that you planned, you have to pivot and walk into a new, often unknown direction. That's what Sandra Martin did so many times in her life. From parenting changes to marriage status to career changes, there have been many then and now moments in Sandra's life. The unexpected life events have definitely affected her parenting style, as well as her expectations and perceptions of her role as a mother. As well, Sandra looks back at her own childhood and how she was raised as she moved forward to a whole new life, her own Act 2. So welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, Sandra. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
It is so great to have you here because you've got such an interesting background, and I know that there are stories that are going to be coming in this podcast. And this particular podcast, part of the reason I wanted to have you on is because we were going to talk about second acts and how those second acts have shaped who you are today as a person and how your upbringing and your childhood and how you're raising your daughters now today. So tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, I am the fourth. I like to call myself the middle-aged love child my parents weren't expecting. So my parents came to Canada from Trinidad and Tobago in the mid-'60s, and they had their two girls and a boy. I think they figured they were done. And they ended up, they wanted a better life. I mean, like every immigrant family. And whoops, Sandra came along 6 years after my brother Don. So I think if I look back on it, my whole life has been a result of second acts. So coming to Canada was my parents' second act. They thought they were done having kids. I was their second act. And it's never been something conscious, but I've never really hesitated from moving on. And I think that's becoming less uncommon, much more accepted and embraced. But back in my parents' day, it was very, very unusual to even shift jobs. I mean, my dad had the same job once he got established in Canada. He had the same job for decades and never really expected or sought anything outside. It was secure, it paid the bills. You know, they ended up sending 4 kids through university. And so they did what they came for. But I think now that we have that as a basis as kids who are now grown up, we look at, okay, what's the next level? There's even more to that. Are we getting greedy? No, we're not getting greedy. There's even more to that we can give our kids. So that's sort of how I approach parenting. It's not about giving. It's about opening up their eyes to opportunities.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I like the fact that you are talking about second acts and how that is kind of the norm these days. Whereas back in the day when you were a child, which I assume is like the 70s, 80s, maybe.
Yeah, I was born in the 70s,
okay,
kind of came of age in the 80s.
Right.
We can leave it at that.
We can leave it at that. That's fine. But I understand that, you know, during that time, it was the norm to get a good job, quote unquote, work at that, quote unquote, good job for most of your life and then retire with a pension. And that was it. These days, I think most of us think about a few careers throughout our lives. And I know that you've had a few careers out throughout your life, as I have. So let's step back a little bit before we get into your career and the career changes that you've made over the last few years. Can you tell me a little bit about what your typical family life was like growing up with your brothers and sisters, where you grew up, what it was like, what were the social mores and norms that you adhere to that you think perhaps are a lot different from how you're living now?
Sure. I mean, I think even it's interesting now that we're all adults, my siblings and I talk about how it was different for them even than it was for me. So my eldest sister is 9 years older. Then my other sister is 8 years older. They're very close in age, and also they've just been great friends their whole lives. And then, as I mentioned, my brother's 6 years older. So it was almost like having 5 parents and living in a house with 3 different generations.
Interesting.
So even in terms of, because when my siblings came to Toronto, they went to a Catholic school. They didn't look like a lot of the other kids. And in Toronto, I think we pride ourselves as being a very multicultural, very accepting city. And that was not their experience of it when they arrived.
Wow. So what were they experiencing?
They got called racial slurs.
Oh, boy.
They got picked out for being different. And then, so they actually had started out in Scarborough, which is in the east end of the city. And then my parents bought a house, the house that I grew up in, the only house I knew until I moved out at 25. And that was a much more mixed neighborhood. So I went to school with kids who were brown and different shades of beige. It was much less white than the experience that my siblings had when they were in junior school. But at the same time, even though I remember this very distinctly, we learned about the Canadian mosaic and how it was different from the melting pot. And then we'd have multicultural day at school where you had to bring in a dish from your background.
And being from Trinidad, did you bring roti? Come on.
I could have, but I actually went home. I was like, I don't really know what I should ask I have still never had a double in my entire life. No, I don't think it's a Trinidadian thing. We definitely had roti. We had different kinds of curry. Cook up, do you remember? I don't know if that's something that's a Trinidadian term.
I think it's more Trini.
It's like jambalaya, pretty much. We had that quite a bit. But people viewed me as being Chinese. So, I mean, my mom is half Chinese, a little bit more than half. And I think I primarily look Chinese. I sometimes get asked if I'm Filipino. It's interesting. Anyway, so I thought, I think I should ask my mom to make fried rice because that's what people expect of me. But I could have picked anything that
you
we
wanted
grew up
to
eating.
Adhere to that expectation as opposed to what you actually really were eating.
Yeah, well, we did eat fried rice. So that's the thing. We ate a lot of, I guess, Trinidadian takes on Chinese food.
Right.
A lot of the stuff, it's funny. Like I'm a foodie as well. So watching David Chang on Netflix, for instance, my maternal grandmother, who didn't look Chinese at all. She had a very tan, she was much more tan than I was, but she married a Chinese man, would have this thing in a jar that she dispensed from a big bag. And she said it was called Witzin. And I was like, I don't know what that is. When I got older, my siblings said, it's that accent stuff that you see on commercials on TV. Do you remember accent? It's monosodium glutamate.
Right, basically salt.
So I thought, what
spices.
kind of made-up word was my grandmother? Because also, coming from Trinidad, there are a lot of idioms that are very specific to that country. So I thought it was an idiom. Well, there's an episode of David Chang's show on Netflix, and he's in this store with a whole wall of these enormous, like bigger than the bags my grandmother would buy from Chinatown. And there it says phonetically Witzin on it.
Oh.
So it was like, I've been seen for the first time.
I feel heard.
Yes, exactly. So, but that didn't exist, that understanding of what other people's cultures look like. We just didn't have access to it then, right? So I knew what I saw at friends' houses. My parents were pretty protective, as I think a lot of immigrant families were. So I didn't do sleepovers, but I would go over to friends' houses for lunch or whatever. But mostly we all ate hot dogs. And, if a friend came over, you didn't have your food. You had the expected food.
The conventional,
so there wasn't that insight into other people's cultures that my kids have growing up just by turning on the TV. And I do think there was less self-acceptance. It's not that I felt different for sure, even though I had kids in my class who looked more or less like me. But there wasn't that celebration that I think
of different
exists
cultures
now.
and such.
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's get back a little bit to what you were talking about in terms of second acts and how, so you've given us a little bit of a background in terms of what your childhood looked like, what it felt like, what were the norms and mores. Let's talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today. So I know your career, you are a former editor and publisher of various magazines. You're a writer, you're a consultant now. Can you tell me how you got into your career path and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I always enjoyed writing for as long as I can remember. And as a matter of fact, my mom used to get, everyone's mom used to get Homemakers magazine for free. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And I used to flip through it. I read through it cover to cover every time it came when I was, I was in grade 2 or grade 3. And there was a byline in it of a writer named Sandra Martin, who probably listeners will have heard of. She's quite acclaimed. She writes for the Globe and Mail, among other things. And we've since met. We look nothing alike. I was relieved to hear that she doesn't think I'm bringing down our shared name, which is why if you've seen my byline in my past life, I threw my middle initial in, E, Sandra E. Martin. But I remember thinking, wow, if I grow up and I become a writer, this is going to be a problem. But I was very practical at the same time. I think that happens when you're raised by immigrant parents.
Yes.
Because my mom, with the surprise fourth child, stayed at home to raise me.
They want you to get that good job.
Right. Well, then my dad was out, slaving, and he'd come home and be really tired. He drove from Etobicoke to Scarborough every day for, it's got to be at least 20 years.
And for those of us who don't know the distance, how far is that?
Well, not in today's traffic. At least it was better for him then. But it would be a good 45 minutes each way in good traffic, in light traffic. My parents worked really, really hard. I actually remember thinking about my mom, how she would cook dinner for 6 kids with 1 chicken. And none of us was ever hungry, ever. I don't know what magic she did, but, I really appreciate how hard they worked to make things happen for us. So I thought, how can you make a living as a writer, whatever? And I was always really good at math and thought, I think I'll be an accountant. That seems like a good job to have. And I took an accounting course in grade 10. There was an intro accounting course you could take. I was like, oh, my God, this is not for me. In the meantime, I took English courses because everyone has to take English all the way through school, and I loved it and had the opportunity to take a media studies course in grade 12. So I'm old enough that I'm in the first year of OAC, so you guys can do the math. And then I took 2 Englishes in OAC as well because I loved it that much. And that was really when I sort of started to think about, could this thing that I love also be something that I do for a living? And that was the first time I ever considered going to journalism school. It just was not on my radar at all as a career option. And
what flipped it for you? So what made you realize that, in spite of the fact that my parents want me to get a conventional job such as accounting or something along those lines, I'm going to throw caution to the wind and I'm going to go into journalism?
I had a couple of really great teachers. Probably the most formative teacher I had in high school, and I don't know if he's still out there, but he really, I don't know what it was about his approach, or he saw that, he saw some kind of promise that I didn't even see in myself or didn't dare see because I'm jumping around, but there's a movie that was also very formative for me. When I was 18, I saw the movie A Room with a View. And I read the book too afterwards, but I enjoyed the movie a lot more, I'm just going to be honest, with Helena Bonham Carter. And she's engaged to marry a character that she doesn't love, who's played by Daniel Day-Lewis. And then she meets this guy, George Emerson, and her eyes are open to what living could be really like. And there's a song that she sings in it when she's kind of working through, do I go through and do I marry Cecil or do I live my life? And there's a line in it that goes, easy live and quiet die. And I think in previous generations, that's what you aspire to. Like, don't make waves, make things go through the path of
and don't
least
take
resistance.
Risks, right?
Exactly.
They always used to say, don't take any risks. Just do what's easy and
that isn't going to be a surprise. So I actually don't know the moment. There wasn't a seminal moment where it flipped for me. But journalism is it's a trade almost, right? So my parents were okay with journalism school. I think if I said I was going to get an undergrad literature degree, they'd be like, what you going to do with that? Are you going to be a teacher? They wanted to know that there was an application for it. And all my siblings, also just for context, I'm the only one of my siblings who does not have a science degree.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And my brother went all the way. He's got a PhD in zoology.
Wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah. But we're all very different. So journalism was okay, and I was able to go to Ryerson here in Toronto. I actually got offered a scholarship to go to Carleton, and my parents took me there for a visit. And everyone
that's in
I
Ottawa?
met, yeah, in Ottawa. And I was a little bit, because I was the youngest, and I was not very adventurous, so I was a little bit scared. But the thing that I would like to think it wasn't because I was scared, but the thing that changed my mind was I went there and everyone who was in the program, well, either there were people who said, oh, I was in journalism in first year and now I'm doing X, Y, or Z. It's like, well, that's not a great sign. And those who were still in journalism wanted to be a foreign correspondent or a political reporter, and that's not really what I wanted to do.
What did you want to do in journalism? Because the journalism, we're talking about the first and the second act. So your first act in journalism, what was the milieu that you stepped into, and how was it in relation to what you thought it would be? Because we're going to get to how you decided to move from that. So I want to hear the origin story of that.
Well, I was incredibly idealistic, as I think all or most young journalists are. I didn't think I was ever going to be a political reporter, and I wasn't going to go to a war-torn region and report from there. That wasn't what I was interested in. I wanted to tell people's stories and somehow make people's lives better. So remember, I grew up at the feet of Homemakers magazine. So I was exposed to lifestyle journalism at a very early age. I also gravitated to magazines that interested me personally. So I've always been interested in the arts. My family, I'm sure, would agree with me when I say that I have a tendency to be dramatic. And my fantasy career is being a cartoon voice artist.
Oh,
that's my fantasy career. So I've always been interested in the arts. I would go to theater. I took drama in high school as my art, because I didn't think I was any good at visual art. So I read fashion magazines and Vanity Fair. I discovered Interview. I was like, oh my gosh, these people have lives that are just so...
When you decided you were going to go into journalism, did you know right off the top, Sandra, that you were going to go into magazine journalism specifically, or was it still very broad?
It was still very broad. And again, I still had that hint of practicality, and I didn't... looking around at the magazines that were produced in Canada that I had visibility to at the time, there weren't a lot of options. So it seemed more realistic to aim to be a newspaper reporter. And I thought that's what I would do. And, my parents got the Toronto Star every day. I don't think a lot of people can say that right now. I mean, they get their news from the Toronto Star potentially, but likely
it was different
digitally.
Back then.
We had the Star
Physical
on our
papers.
doorstep every day. And I always pulled out the life section first, and then I would read the front section. And the stories that interested me most were the stories about people. So people overcoming adversity or accomplishing interesting things. That was my jam. And even when I started journalism school, it didn't occur to me to specialize in magazines until you had to sign up for your second-year courses and decide what your specialty was going to be. And so I talked to my instructors, and newspaper instructors said, oh, yeah, you'd be fine in newspapers. And talked to my broadcast instructor. Actually, because I got exposed to broadcast, I was a very awkward-looking child. I mean, I don't know that much is, but I was not great-looking. I didn't date in high school. I'm sure
that's just in your head.
No, I did not date in high school. I had bad hair, bad skin. And I didn't have a ton of self-confidence about how I looked or would present as a broadcaster. But I found when I took my broadcast course in first year that I was kind of good at it. And actually the one discipline we didn't get a chance to try in first year was magazines. But I knew I loved them. And I thought... I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to go for it. What's the worst thing that can happen? I'm still going to have exposure to all of this other stuff. So I did it, fell even deeper in love. And
was it everything that you thought it would be cracked up to be?
Yeah, at first.
At first, I sense another story coming. What does that mean?
Yeah,
I think we're going into that second act.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing I loved about magazines is you had more time to make it as perfect as possible, to make your story as perfect as possible. I think I'm a pretty good writer, but I think I'm a better editor, and I enjoy editing more. Maybe because I'm bossy and I like telling people what to do. But you have that opportunity, whether you're the writer or the editor, to work on a story. You have fact checking, or you did at that time. So you could put out the closest to perfect experience for a reader. And the whole process of photo shoots and selecting in third year Ryerson, you get to produce a magazine called the Ryerson Review of Journalism. And you go through the whole process of creating a magazine, or we had the chance to, where you choose the font, you choose the paper stock you want, you choose the type of art direction you want. And all of that really appealed to me as someone who not only loves the words of the magazine, but the entire experience.
The whole package. You wanted to put together the whole package from inception to birth, I guess. Right?
Yeah. So that kind of spoiled me for the rest of my days. And that not as spoiled. It did spoil me because it's such a luxury to be able to start something. And I'm lucky to say that I actually have been able to start a few ventures from the beginning in my career that I actually got paid for. But I loved every part of it. I even loved the long hours because I'm crazy that way too.
Yeah. So you went through school, you went through Ryerson. You graduate. Where do you land?
Well, I graduated in a recession. I was still living with my parents because I stayed at home. Upside to that, and also university was so much less expensive than it is now. All of my siblings and I were able to pay for our tuition just from summer jobs. And I mean, I think some kids are able to do that now, but it's difficult. Much tougher. So I had no debt, and my parents... they expected if we were to live at home, we would pay some kind of rent, assuming we were working. And I got a couple of freelance gigs right off the top. They weren't long-term, but they paid a little bit of money, and I didn't have any expenses. I had to pay car insurance. Nobody had a phone then, so I didn't have to pay that. And I was doing a 6-week vacation replacement. I can't remember if it was a vacation. It was someone who was on vacation and then ended up leaving the magazine. A copy editor of Flair magazine, which is a title that I admired and aspired to be in fashion, even though I was not a fashion girl. So I was doing that. I had done a bit of freelance at a magazine called Wear, which is sister magazine for Toronto Life. So most people wouldn't have seen Wear Toronto because if you live here, because Torontonians don't usually stay in hotels unless they're having like a date weekend or whatever. But I had a job offer from them. Then we found out that the copy editor from Flair wasn't coming back, and I had the opportunity to interview for that job. So this was the first big decision,
like
of
a real
my career.
Job, right?
Right. So they were both real jobs. The Wear magazine job was full time. I think I was going to be paid $22,000. Wow. Which I knew was kind of bad, but I was thrilled. But I had the opportunity to say, well, you guys are giving me a break, but here's this other thing that I might want to chase. And I decided I was going to stick with the job that I was guaranteed. Who knows how things would have played out if I had pursued the copy editing job, which is really sitting at a desk working on manuscripts. It's a great job for someone right out of journalism school, but at Wear, which was a less well-known title, I got to do restaurant reviews. I got to interview David Cronenberg. I got to cover TIFF. So in terms of personal growth, I mean, it may not have had the allure or the prestige of working at a national title, but oh my gosh, I got so much experience from that gig. And I stayed there for just over 3 years.
So 3 years. So you're at Wear, and then where do you go?
So I was kind of looking around. I had applied for a couple of jobs and got close and started to get discouraged because I'd find out who got the job and it was always a guy.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I was going for not fashion or lifestyle-y kind of magazines, but again, magazines that told interesting stories. There's a magazine that doesn't exist anymore that was called Equinox that kind of married. I grew up talking about science around the dinner table. And even to this day, when my family gets together, if there's someone from outside of the family, like we'll have to remember that there's certain things we shouldn't talk about. And I didn't get, I mean, it might have just been not the right time or not quite the right fit. But I was starting to get a bit discouraged and contacted mine. So at Where Magazine, I did arts listings, so events and arts that were happening around the city. And a contact of mine, who was the publicist at the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, I was just chatting with her one day, and I must have conveyed that I was interested. I was looking, and she said, well, you wouldn't be interested in working here, would you? Our publications editor is leaving. I was like, oh? That's interesting. So keep in mind, I don't have a music degree. At this point, I've only ever played the recorder. But I love music, and I have a curious mind. And I've got good training in journalism, which I was taught and firmly believe that if you're a good journalist, you can come to understand something enough to explain it well and accurately to somebody else. And that's the approach I took with this job. It's interesting because it wasn't a burning desire that I'd been sitting on, but when the idea presented itself, I thought, I could do this. This could be really interesting.
So you actually went to the music publication?
Yeah.
From where?
So I edited the program books. If you're in the audience at the Symphony, you get a program book, and there's some feature articles. So sometimes it's a profile of a guest artist, musician, and then every guest artist gets a profile, a short bio inside the magazine. And then there are program notes. And the tradition of program notes is they're very scholarly, and symphonic music is very traditional, or especially was at this time. The latest music director that the Toronto Symphony Orchestra has had, Peter Ungian, has changed that a great deal. He's quite populist and sort of controversial for that, or when he was chosen. I wasn't there at his time, but it was interesting to see that the marketing director who hired me, who liked the idea I had of treating the program book as more of a fan magazine without, going too far outside the comfort zone. I mean, keeping it elegant and somewhat restrained, but really focusing on the fact that you're here because you love this music.
So it sounds like you were able to take something that was a staid publication that had been consistently created to look and feel a certain way, and you were able to put your stamp on it and change it. You were able to put a second act.
Yeah. Well, I do have to give credit to another Sandra, Sandy M.A. McDonald, who was my boss, who believed in that vision and supported it, and took a chance on hiring the first program publications editor that the organization ever had who didn't have a music degree. So that took a lot of guts. I'm grateful for that. I'm so grateful for that. I also really, looking back, it was such a mountain of work, but what an incredible opportunity. I was 21 when I graduated from journalism school. I skipped a grade, so I was a year ahead of a lot of my peers. So I would have been like 24. To be given that opportunity, that was unbelievable. I still can't believe I got to do that now.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many things that are going through my mind right now in terms of your career, your path, your trajectory. We haven't talked about your personal life yet, which I really want to get to in terms of the second act.
I don't want to disappoint you, Sam.
You won't. You won't. So I think I'm going to just take a quick break for a word from our sponsor, and then we're going to come back and we're going to keep talking. So just before the break, Sandra, we were talking about your fantastic role that you got working with the symphony and the opportunity that you got to change the way that things were done. And I'm getting a really strong feeling that you were doing a lot of work. Was there any personal life stuff that was happening?
Yeah, so it's actually one of my coworkers who started about 2/3 of the way through my time at the symphony, whose name is also Sandra. Are you seeing a pattern here?
I am.
Anyway, she said, "Oh, Sandra, you're single. You know, I have a brother-in-law who's single, and he's really cute. You should meet him." And I said, "Oh, I don't know that that's such a good idea. We work together, and if it didn't work out, it might be awkward." Anyway, there used to be this singles series, and maybe it still exists at the symphony, where you could buy your ticket and there would be talk before the concert, and you could mingle with other single people who were also interested in the symphony. And I hope I don't get into trouble for sharing this, but there were never as many men as women. I don't think that's going to be a shocker. So occasionally we would be asked to recruit male friends and relatives to join. So one night I'm doing my thing. We all did what we called concert duty, but we were talking about martinis. He must have been drinking a martini, and I really like martinis with gin, even though I can't drink them anymore. I find them too strong because I'm old. So we got in this conversation about gin versus vodka, and he also liked gin martinis, and we were chatting, and we ended up connecting again at another outing, and then he asked me out, and he ended up becoming my husband.
How long after that first interaction with him did that
Oh my
take?
gosh, it just, having two kids who didn't sleep my memory is not amazing, but less than 3 years for sure. We moved in together not that long after we started dating. Just sometimes it's out of practicality, right? And we were together for about 17 years, married for nearly 15. And then, I actually never thought I was ever going to get married. It wasn't something that, like some women have that dream of having a family, finding a partner, having a family. And I didn't dislike kids, but it wasn't something that I ever saw for myself until I met this guy. So we got together. I was still very career-minded. I moved to another job at Money Sense magazine. So again, my love of math came in to help me with that. It's a personal finance magazine that still exists digitally. And we got married, and of course, baby talk. I was 29 when we got married, and then I thought, let's have a baby. So we had one baby and then another, and I never really imagined that it was ever going to change.
So you were comfortable in your life, with your career, with your marriage. Did you feel that everything was going well in both veins?
I thought so, but to be honest, I think I was selfish. I think I expected a lot of accommodation to happen on behalf of my career. So I got busier as the years went on. So I was with Money Sense for 5 years, and then was on mat leave, came back, and then was offered a job that was half broadcast, half newspaper with the National Post and Global. And I was in my early 30s at the time. And, what did I know? I thought I was getting long in the tooth. And I thought, well, if I'm going to try this broadcast thing, I got to do it now. So I took that job, and, as intense as working on a magazine can be, at the time it was much more predictable than I think anyone who's working in a magazine now would say there's nothing predictable about their hours. But at the time, it was quite predictable. And then I moved into this situation where sometimes I was filing a story that I was assigned that day, which was a new thing for me. So another second act, if you will. And meanwhile, we had a very young baby. There were some shifts at the newspaper, and I was asked to head up a weekly section. Again, super amazing experience to build something. But doing a weekly section is crazy deadlines. And I had like an 18-month, 2-year-old at home.
And how did you navigate that?
You know what? My kid's dad is a great dad, and he just did a lot of it. And like I said, I took it for granted. I don't know that I've ever said that to him before, but thank you, Matt. I don't think I appreciated you at the time. So, I mean, these are things that you can't.
Yeah, well, sometimes hindsight is 20/20. Sometimes when we're in the midst of things, we can't see them clearly because we're so busy just trying to get through that day and that hour and that moment. It's only when we look back later on. So don't beat yourself up over it, you know. It's good to have some clarity in hindsight.
Yeah. But I also think, so not to make this too sad a story, I think we're pretty good friends now. I would like to think so. He's engaged again, and his fiance and he have been over to my place for dinner with other friends that we've had for, over a decade. Matt's fiance has a daughter, and she's like in between our girls' ages, and they all get along. So it's something that I think is quite new for this generation.
I think it's new too. I mean, I've had, I think you know Brandy Weekly as well, and she's been on the show, and she has a lovely, wonderful podcast, The New Family, about new families, and she's a really great supporter of having good relationships and co-parenting relationships with spouses and ex-spouses and such. And I think that this is kind of part of this whole kind of second act thing or new family thing that we're talking about, because I don't think that was the norm back when you grew up as a child, nor do I think that you probably would have thought that would be the norm now after realizing that your marriage would not last and you'd be co-parenting. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I met Brandy when I think we both worked for the same publishing company, and she pitched me on something. And then I'd heard that she and her, and it's a small world, even though it's not a small world. And then I heard that she and her co-parent were sharing a driveway, and I thought, wow, that is amazing. I don't think that's got to be a once in a lifetime, once in a country kind of situation. I mean, they were very groundbreaking. Mm-hmm, and now I belong to Brandy's Facebook group, Positive
And I will link to that on the show notes because she's doing amazing things.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are still struggling, but a lot of people who are, communicating and working through their stuff and remaining, having a good relationship with their co-parent because they understand that that's what's best for their kids. I mean, you're never going to stop being your kid's parents. So, why make it difficult? I mean, I've heard about people who don't even see their co-parent when they do drop-off. They'll have a nanny or a third party do the difficult transfer of their kids. And I just can't imagine what that's like for the kids.
Yeah, that would be really hard, I think, for all parties, for both parents and for the child or children, because it's automatically a negative situation. So I want to get back to the second act, because that is the ongoing thread of this discussion. So you get to the point where you make a decision with your ex-spouse that you're going to move on, you're going to go your separate ways, and I'm very heartened to hear that you have a good relationship with him and everybody's happy in terms of the kids. Where are you now in terms of your second act, in terms of your career second act, in terms of your relationship second act? And equally as important, and one of the key focuses of this show, with your kids and your second act and their second acts.
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of questions there. I think, going back to the career thing and the marriage thing. So my parents were only ever married to each other. My mom passed away late last year. And my dad saw her every day. She was living in a long-term care facility. She had dementia for a number of years. And he was so devoted to her and also volunteered at the home. But and I would like to think, if God forbid, and there was ever a health issue with my co-parent, that there have been small bumps and we've supported each other through it, even something as small as, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had to travel, and Nicole won't be able to is doing something. Can you take the girls? I mean, we're pretty flexible about that. So I would like to think that part of our marriage would survive in the way that my parents' marriage did at the end. But, my dad had the same job for years. I wanted to look up some statistics because I'm a journalist and I don't ever like talking off the top of my head. But according to statistics and trends, Canadians can expect to hold approximately 15 jobs through the course of their career.
Really?
Their working lifetime. 15 jobs. Whereas as the boomer generation entered their 50s, more than half of them had been in the same job for 20 years or more. So, I'm approaching 50. There's no job I've been in for more than just shy of 7 years. I was at Today's Parent magazine for just shy of 7 years, and that seemed like a long time to me. Not because I wasn't having a great time, it's just not done anymore.
No, it's not done anymore. My first job out of university, I was in it for 8, almost 9 years. Then I was in a job for 4 years. Then I had a second act too. I went into communications and PR, and now I do media stuff and all kinds of stuff. But I think that the younger generation and the younger kids, maybe millennials and younger, are expecting and are used to the idea that nothing is going to be as permanent as it was when our parents or even when we were coming up. And I wonder about your kids and my kids, right? So what do you think your kids are thinking in terms of their career life and plans and expectations?
Well, the difference is my kids have seen both their dad and myself go through a number of different job transitions. So they still had a roof over their heads, nothing traumatic happened. So they see this as being part of the rhythm of life. And it's okay to want something different. Whereas I think our parents' generation was, well, this is a good job. It pays the bills. It's secure. What more do you want? And I think my kids will say it's okay to want more. It's okay to want to feel fulfilled in a way that probably, I don't think my dad felt fulfilled or even asked to be fulfilled from his job.
So it was really more out of responsibility and obligation in their generation as opposed to now. Do you think that we facilitate more as a society and as parents the idea that you have to follow your dreams and just see where the chips land? Or?
Well, I don't. I think for me, I can only speak for myself and also what I've observed with other parents in my peer group. I think it's something in the middle. It's, okay, you can't just take a course of study that doesn't have any kind of application. You have to have a plan because at some point you're going to have to support yourself. But, perfect illustration is my older daughter goes to an arts high school. Mm-hmm. And it's easier than ever to go into a high school that's not your home high school, right? When I was in an enrichment program from grades 5 through 8, and I actually decided, there are a number of things. I wasn't crazy about the experience I had. That's a whole other podcast, Sam. But I also didn't want to wake up any earlier anymore. So I thought I'm just going to go to my home high school, the high school my sisters went to. My brother was in an enrichment program for high school also, which was not the enrichment high school that I could have gone to. Have I lost you yet? Anyway, there was the choice of if you qualified for that kind of program or you went to your home high school. Whereas now, your kid's in grade 8, you get to visit any number of high schools that are open to you. And some of them you do have to apply for. My older daughter, Bronwyn, had to apply to get into her arts high school. But the option is much more available now. So I think as a society, we're set up to encourage young people to follow what they feel their talents or desires or dreams are. Yeah.
More so than before.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question for you. What would you say? We've talked a lot about first acts, second acts. What is your third act going to be, Sandra?
Well, I actually I worked for a charity called We for just over a year and had some really incredible experiences, but have moved into another act with that as well where, we kind of figured that they didn't need me full-time anymore mutually. And so I'm consulting for them half-time and signed on to teach a journalism course at Ryerson. So I'm going back to my... It's a lot nicer looking now than it was in 1992 when I graduated. So that's my next act. I actually never thought I wanted to be a teacher. And there's some of the experiences I've had over the past year presenting workshops and hosting events that we has held for school groups. I thought, wow, these kids are so turned on. They're so plugged in. And I love I have to tell you this quick story. So we had a speaker from the Globe and Mail in talking about food insecurity, who's probably in her early 30s, Asian Canadian background. And the audience of students was very diverse. And there were kids coming up to her at the end asking for her autograph.
Really?
And I thought, this warms my heart and spirit so much. She was a rock star to them. So here is someone who kind of looked like them, who was doing what they perceived as really important, interesting, cool work.
You know what? It actually makes me think that everything that our parents told us, and it doesn't matter if you're a millennial, if you're a baby boomer, if you're Generation X or whatever, everything our parents told us was true in that you can be anything you want to be. It's just that now what you want to be is going to change every few years.
And you have to not be afraid of it.
Yeah. What a note to end on.
I'll have to replay that part every time I'm getting a little bit afraid. But
well, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been really enlightening and really interesting hearing about your life, Sandra.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sam.
Thank you. Change doesn't have to be bad. Change is good, even if you don't think so at the time. Ditto for uncertainty, because that lack of knowing what's coming next is what challenges us to rise up and be the person that we were always meant to be. In Sandra Martin's case, change came in the form of a series of second acts that were informed by her childhood that ironically was consistent and unchanging, yet solid in its foundation in making Sandra the woman that she became. Parenting then, as her parents taught her, was something very different to how Sandra is raising her two daughters, as the specter of change, new beginnings, second acts, including marriage, divorce, career, and more, inform her life as she moves on to her own Act 2. This was a fascinating discussion with a fascinating and accomplished woman, and I learned a lot about life, changes, parenting, being able to pivot, and so much more. Thank you, Sandra, for sitting down with me and for sharing your story.